Hey everyone, so today we are going to cover a couple of fundamental questions on fundamentals of Apex, and these are very important because even when I take mock interviews and whenever I have to make a candidate bit uncomfortable, I start with the object-oriented concepts and then couple of fundamental question, and that most of the time students become bit defensive there because they all practice trigger, they all practice lightning web component, but these are the things which most of the time people do not revise, or sometimes their even concepts are bit weak. So interviewers take advantage of that, and even though these are easy questions, we sometimes fail to answer these questions. Okay, so let us go through these questions one by one. Before that, let us see couple of considerations. Okay, couple of things you should know. Okay, so most of these things are related to with sharing and without sharing only. So you are able to see my screen. Do I need to zoom it more? No, it's fine. Okay, so if an inner class is declared as with sharing and outer class is declared as without sharing, then the entire context will run in the with sharing. Okay, this is something you need to remember. If the inner class is with sharing and outer class is without sharing, then the entire context will run in with sharing. But if it is opposite, like if the outer class is with sharing and inner class is without sharing, then in that case the inner class will only run in the without sharing context. Okay, so sometimes they ask questions related to this, whether the inner class will inherit the sharing context from the outer class. So the answer is no. Inner class will not inherit the sharing context from the outer class. Let's say outer class is with sharing, inner class is without sharing, then inner class will remain without sharing. It will not inherit the context from the top class, from the upper class or the outer class. But if the inner class is with sharing and outer class is without sharing, then whole context will become with sharing. Okay, so remember that.
Mohit, can you repeat again once?
Yes, should I write it down? Okay, let me see if I can bring my pen here. Okay. I have this pen, digital pen, but I hardly use it. Sometimes few concepts requires explanation. I most of the time use it in the triggers because I have to draw the flow chart. Okay, just a second. Now I'll have to set this. You are able to see whiteboard or what you are able to see?
Whiteboard.
Perfect. Okay. Let me see if I'm able to write. Okay, perfect. So what I'm trying to say is if there is an outer class, okay, and then there is an inner class. Okay, now if outer class is,
Mohit, you are writing anywhere?
you're not able to see what I'm writing?
No.
We can see.
I am able to see.
We can see.
I am also not able to see.
That
I am able to see.
you all are able to see whiteboard, right?
Yeah.
Yes, what?
Yep.
How can this be possible that you are not able to see? Okay.
If you have joined via phone, then just zoom in, then you'll be able to see.
Hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I can see now.
Perfect.
It is middle of the board.
Phone is always tricky. That is why I never take classes from phone. I understand. Okay, let's start. Okay, so if our outer class, if we have an outer class, okay. If I have an outer class, let's say outer class, and then inside we have an inner class. And this, if our outer class is with shading, and if our inner class is without shading. In this case, our inner class will remain without shading. It will not inherit shading context from the top class. Okay. If our inner class is without shading, then it will remain without shading. It will not inherit anything from the outer class. That's what I have written on the notes as well, that inner class will not inherit from the outer class. Okay. So even if we declare our outer class as with shading, we cannot expect our inner class to follow the same behavior. That is why we specifically write without shading in the inner class. If we do not write without shading, then it will take whatever is written in the outer class. So if we do not specifically define without shading in the inner class, then in that case, our inner class will also run in the with shading context. Okay, so this also answers our major questions why we have a without shading when classes by default follow the without shading behavior. That's right. If we do not define anything with shading or without shading, it will be without shading. Okay. So sometimes they ask this interview questions, why to write without shading when the by default behavior is without shading. So this is the answer. When we do not define without shading in the inner class, then it will run whatever context given to outer class. So if outer class is with shading, then inner class will also run in the with shading if we do not define anything. But if we have to make sure that inner class run in the without shading context, then we will have to specifically define without shading. Okay. That is part one. Part two is if we have same outer class and inner class. If we have an outer class, and then we have an inner class. Now our inner class is with shading and our outer class is without shading. In this case, the complete execution of this class will run in the with shading context because it has a class, it has an inner class which is with shading. So the whole class will respect this with shading and the complete class will become the with shading even if outer class was defined as without shading. Okay, so this is what you need to remember in the interview as well as whenever you give any interview, write any classes. Okay, we have to use with sharing and without sharing very carefully because obviously it determines the data. Okay, it determines what data the end user will be able to see. Now let me go back to the questions. Okay, this is not what I wanted to share. I want to share the interview questions. Okay, so point number 27, point number 28, we have only covered these two. Any question on these 2 points? Okay, next point. One should always specify a sharing class. Okay, even though classes runs by default in the without sharing context, we have to specify a sharing class because that's what Salesforce recommend us. That will avoid the confusion as well. Okay, because here we are only talking about one class, but in the reality, what happens is that there will be multiple classes and they will be calling each other. To avoid the confusion, we will have to specify the sharing clause in the classes. Okay, and we will understand it when we talk about when another class calls this class. Okay, so let us also cover that. Okay, there is a class A and there is a class B. Class A is calling class B. Okay, now class A, let's say, is with sharing. Okay, class A has a method which is with sharing. Class B has a method which is without sharing. Now, when class A calls the class B or the method of class B, what will be the sharing context of class B? Okay, this is a very important interview question. Let me repeat the question. Okay, there are two classes, class A and class B. Class A is calling a method of class B. Class A is written in with sharing. Class B is written in without sharing. What will be the sharing context of class B when class A calls it? Okay, that's an interview question they ask to trick you. Always remember, in any of the question like this, the class which is in question, it will follow the sharing context of the, okay, let me explain it by example. Otherwise you guys will get confused. What I want to say is, yeah, this point. The sharing setting of a class where a method is defined is applied, not of the class where the method is called from. So in this case, class A is calling, it does not matter if class A is written in with sharing or without sharing. You are calling class B, a method of class B. So whatever sharing context you have written on class B will be applied. Okay, it will not. See, if you are calling it from class A, then class A sharing settings will not override the sharing settings of class B. Okay. So this might be a bit confusing. Okay. Yep. It will run in the without context. You are right, Utkarsh. So we have to remember this point as well. The sharing setting of a class where a method is defined is applied, not of the class where the method is called from. So in this case, class A was with sharing, class B was without sharing, and if class A will call the class B, then also it will run in the without sharing, because class B or the method we are talking about was defined in class B, which was without sharing. Okay, so don't get confused in questions like this. Now there is a point, if a class is the entry point into an Apex transition, not specifying a sharing class defaults it to without sharing. What do we mean by class is the entry point into Apex transaction? Okay, see, we have a class, and how that class will be called. If we call a class inside a trigger, if we call a class inside the trigger, then entry point was a trigger, class was called from trigger. But let's say if we have written a batch class, then batch class is the entry point in itself, that will be entry point itself. And if we do not define anything there, then it will run in the without sharing context. So let's say you have a batch class, which is obviously the entry point in the Apex transaction. It will not be executed by something else. It will start the transaction will start from the class itself. Okay, so that basically calls as the known as the entry point of the class. So if we have a batch class and if we do not define anything, then it will run in the without sharing context. Okay. If a class is entry point into Apex transaction and specifying inherited sharing defaults it to with sharing, that's where the inherited sharing comes in the picture. Okay, if you define a class with inherited sharing, and if that class is the entry point, then it will by default it to with sharing. If that class is not the entry point, then obviously it depends on which class is calling this particular class, and depending on that class's sharing context, it will either take with sharing or without sharing. But if that class is the entry point, then if you define the inherited sharing, see, inherited sharing is basically a dynamic way to define if your class is going to be with sharing or without sharing. Inherited sharing does not have its own execution method. It will basically just dynamically determine if your class will get executed in with sharing or without sharing. If you want to have a flexibility that a class should run can run in the with sharing or without sharing, both possible, depending on which class is calling that class. Or if it is an entry point, then it should run in the with sharing. If it is getting called from any other class, then it should run in the without sharing. So in that class, you will call this particular class from any other class in the with sharing context. Okay, so inherited sharing is nothing but a dynamic way to determine with sharing or without sharing at the runtime. Okay. And in case of uh, this 34 point, class inherit sharing settings from parent class when one class extend or implement other class. Okay, so when you extend or implement any other class, okay, then your class will inherit the sharing settings of the parent class. So let's say you extended a class A in your class B, then your class B, with whether your class B will be with sharing or without sharing depends on what sharing context your class A is in, because you are extending that class. So always remember, in case of extending or implementing, your class will inherit the sharing settings from the parent class or the base class. Okay, so interview questions can be really tricky in this because they can combine multiple things and then they can ask. But if your base is clear, if your fundamentals of strong, you will be able to understand the question, and also you will be able to realize like what will be the answer of it. Always remain focused and focus on your fundamentals. If your fundamentals are strong, even if I try to combine 2 3 things and I try to trick you, you will be able to answer. But for that, your fundamentals should be strong. Okay, and these 5 6 points are the fundamental point. Okay, 1 2 3 4 5 6. If you remember these 6 7 points, you will be able to answer every question in it. Just don't get confused in it. Now we will go through the questions. Okay, can we use access modifiers with trigger? No, we cannot use any access modifiers with the trigger. Trigger by default runs in the without sharing context, and we do not have any options to change that. Okay, so if somebody asks you what is the by default sharing context of trigger, it is without sharing. Okay, and we cannot use any access modifier with triggers like global, public, protected, nothing. Okay. Can we use access modifiers with interface? Yes, we use access modifiers with interface, but we can only use the public access modifiers with the interface. Okay, we cannot use other access modifiers. Okay, if you try to use other access modifiers with the interface, you might get error. Okay, not might, you will get an error. So we have an interface, right? We created an interface.
Hey Mohit, can we change the sharing context of trigger?
No, we cannot change that.
Okay, so it is by default.
It is by
Without,
default
and we cannot
without
change.
sharing, and it will not, there is no option to change it. There is no option to add any access modifiers or keyword with it. Okay. Test, test, interface. So let's create an interface. By default, it will create in the public, but if I try to use it, let's say global, why we are not getting any error? Let's say private. Top level class must have public or globally visible. Okay, I will check this if global is allowed or not, but I think as per documentation, need to check if global is. Okay, I will check this. But we cannot use any other thing with it. Okay, so you remember that for now. Can we use protected access modifiers with Apex class? No. Same reason. Top level type must have public or global visibility. Okay. So what I want from you guys is that whenever you get interview questions, you not only answer this, but you also tell that why it is happening. So in case if somebody asks you, can we use protected access modifier with an Apex class? You can say that no, top level class must be either global or public visibility. Okay. We cannot have protected class because it will not have the public visibility. The reason why we are creating a class is that should be available within at least your Salesforce, right? And then inner class obviously can be protected. Default access modifiers for Apex class. Okay, see, there is no such thing as default access modifiers. Okay, we have to define either public or global while declaring the class. Okay, there is no by default. When we create a class, it will by default create as public. We can change it to global, but there is nothing like if we do not provide either public or global, it will be public by default. There is nothing as by default access modifiers. Okay. So when I'm saying access modifiers, it is public, private, protected, right? Not the with sharing and without sharing. That is the sharing context. So don't get confused with it. Interviewer might try to confuse you. Okay. Can you create an outer class with private access modifiers? No. Same reason. Same reason for the protected. Same reason is for the private. Top level class should be either public or global. Can inner method be global if outer class is public? See, if outer class is public, then obviously inner method cannot be global, right? Either you make the outer class as global, then you can make the method global. Otherwise, you will get an error on this. Okay. And whatever I have written here, you guys need to implement these things in your org. These are something which you can easily implement on your org if you differ with the answer, or if you feel that you're not able to understand the answer, or if you feel that they should be allowed. Like if I'm saying inner method can be global if outer class is public, you feel that it should be allowed, then you try it on your own as well. If I have written no, we might get a different view. Can constructor be private in Apex? Yes, constructor can be private in Apex. Okay, we can have a private constructor which is parameterized or which is non-parameterized, and then pass the value internally within that class. So we can have a private constructor within class, and we have uh, done this thing. Can a constructor return a value in Apex? No, constructor cannot have any return type. Okay, many times guys get it wrong. Like when I try to confuse them by saying, okay, why we use constructor is to assign value. Once we assign the value, we will have to pass that value, right? So that other methods will be able to use it. So we are passing we are returning the value via constructor. So how you are saying constructor cannot return, and they will get confused. They will say, yeah, we may return the value. Okay, so constructor cannot return the value. They will just assign the value. They will get the value, and based on that, they will assign the value to your class level variables, and then you can use those variables. Constructor will not have a return statement. Okay, don't get confused with it. Can a constructor be an abstract? No, constructor cannot. We cannot use abstract keyword with constructor. Okay. And what is abstract keyword? You'll have to go back to the classes which we have taken on fundamentals. If we have any new person, or if you have not revised that. Can a class have multiple constructor in Apex? Yes, we can have multiple constructor. We saw that. We saw that here when we did the constructor example. This class has one constructor, two constructor. So we can do that. Okay. And we can also make a constructor private. Yeah, so we will be able to make a constructor private. A constructor can call another constructor. This is how we are calling this constructor from this constructor. We can have multiple constructor. Constructor can be private, but constructor cannot have a return statement. Like if I try to return something, constructor must not return a value. Okay, so we cannot return anything from the constructor. Okay, see, any person who has a good fundamentals will be able to answer this. My worry is for the people who do not have good fundamentals. Mostly the people who come from a different background. They do not, obviously they learn Salesforce from somewhere, and that someone or somewhere they learn directly writing triggers. So my worry is for the people who directly write triggers without going to rigorous exercises on the fundamentals. Most of the time these people fail to answer these fundamentals question. I want everyone to be able to answer, especially my students should basically uh, rock this section. This section is something I want my student to be strong at, so that when you are able to answer the questions on fundamental, this give an impression that this guy is fundamentally very good. If a person is fundamentally very good, then he can learn anything. But if someone's fundamentals of are not strong, then that gives an impression that he might have just studied this particular piece, but he might not be able to learn anything very tricky or anything very new. So fundamentals are very important, and that is why I focus a lot on these fundamentals. Okay. Can you call a constructor from another constructor? Yes, of course. That's what we have done in the constructor exercise, and we were able to. What is the order of execution of constructor in Apex? Obviously, it is parent to child. So parent constructor will be called first, and if there is any child constructor, then that. See, constructor is the first line which we create, which runs, because we create the instance of the class and then write new and then class name. That is constructor calling. Okay, so constructor will be called first. And if there are multiple constructor, parent constructor and child constructor, then obviously parent constructor will be called first. Okay. And if there are multiple constructor written within the same class, then the order in which they are written, plus how we are creating the instance. So if there is a parameterized constructor and we are creating an instance and passing the parameters, then obviously parameterized constructor will be called first. Okay. Now this is an important interview question. If the class with sharing is calling a method of another class without sharing, what will happen? Okay, so I told you, and our point, if you see our point, it says that the sharing setting of the class where a method is defined is applied, not the class where the method is called from. So according to this, if we go through this question, if a class with sharing is calling a method of another class without sharing, what will be the sharing context? Obviously, the method will run in the without sharing, because it depends on where the method is defined, not from where we are calling it. Okay, so where the method is defined, that class is without sharing. So this method will run in the without sharing context only. Okay, because of that fundamental point. Default sharing mode of Apex class, obviously, if we do not define anything, then it will run in the without sharing context. Can we use with sharing or without sharing in triggers? No, we cannot use with sharing or without sharing. It is always without sharing by default. We cannot change it. Okay. If the class with sharing is calling another method of another class with sharing, what will happen? Obviously, if the method is written in the with sharing context, then it will be called in the with sharing context. It does not depend on which class is calling and what is the sharing context of that. It depends on where it is written and what is the sharing context of that class. So it will run in the with sharing. Okay. Now next question is, you have a complete Apex class that performs multiple queries and updates to a custom object. How can you ensure that all these operations respect FLS setting for the current user? So for FLS, there are multiple options. I have shared that link with you that has a couple of options. We can use user mode. This is the latest, you can say, from the Apex. If you use user mode in the operation in the, let's say, SOQL query, then it will respect FLS. Apart from user mode, you have the schema classes. From the schema classes, you can get that particular field and check if if that user is able to access that field, and based on that you can perform operations. If not user mode, then you have security enforced keyword. If you enforce the security, then also it will respect FLS. If you can use stripe inaccessible, then it will stripe all the inaccessible fields. So there are multiple options you get, but the best option among all is user mode operation. So you will use user mode operations to do that. There are multiple options available to make sure that FLS is maintained, but go through the link I have shared you. It has all the 4 options. Try to implement those, and this is the best option among those. So that is why I have written that. Can we use with sharing or without sharing with a global class or method? Yes, we can use with sharing or without sharing, even with the global context as well. Okay. What is the difference between primitive data and S object data? I want the answer of this from the class. Anybody wants to take that? This is the most fundamental question. Okay, see, primitive data types are already defined data class like string, like integer, like Boolean. They are already available. Whereas S object data type is the data type which we create within Salesforce. Okay, so they are Salesforce specific data types which we create by creating the S objects and data of S object. Whereas primitives are like already defined data types like integer, Boolean. Specific definitions I have written on my notes. I will give you my notes. I just want you to have an understanding about what is the major difference between them. Okay. All right. Inherited sharing, I have already explained. Inherited sharing is a kind of sharing which we use to dynamically determine the sharing context of a class. Okay. If we have defined an inherited sharing in a class, and if another class is calling that class, then it will take the sharing context of the class which is calling it. Okay, if it is calling with sharing, then your class's sharing context will become with sharing. If another without sharing class is calling your class, then it will become without sharing. Because you have used inherited sharing, you have given an option to your class that it can run in both mode depending on which class is calling. Okay, but if your class, you have written it as inherited sharing and that class itself is starting the transaction, like in case of a batch class starts the transaction, there is no other trigger point of that, right? So in that case, if you are using inherited sharing, you can see it here. If the class is used as an entry point to an apex transaction, an omitted sharing declaration runs as without sharing. However, inherited sharing ensures that default it runs to with sharing. Okay, a class declared as inherited sharing runs as without sharing only when explicitly called from an already established without sharing context. Okay, let's figure it out. What is it trying to say? I have written an inherited sharing class. If that class is starting the transaction, if that class is the initial point of the transaction, then it will run in the with sharing context. Okay, you can see it here. If the class is used as an entry point to an apex transaction, inherited sharing ensures that the default it runs as with sharing. If you do not define anything and if class runs as a entry point of any transaction, by default it will run in the without sharing. But if you are using inherited sharing and that class starts the transaction, then it will run in the with sharing context. If you have defined an inherited sharing class, it will run in the without sharing mode only when it will be called from any other class which is without sharing. So here it is trying to say a class declared as inherited sharing runs as without sharing only when explicitly called from an already established without sharing context. Okay, so this might be a bit confusing for a few people. Go through these notes, come back to me later on with your doubts if you have any. Don't worry about if this is a bit confusing for you, don't worry about it. I understand this might confuse you. Okay, why there is a without sharing keyword in Apex when default class behaves same like without sharing? Okay, so we have answered this earlier. If there is an outer class which is with sharing, inner class is without sharing, then inner class will run in the without sharing context. But if you do not define without sharing, then inner class will run in the with sharing context. So without sharing is very important when we explicitly want a particular inner class to run in the without sharing context. And that is also true from the other class. So if class A, which is with sharing, is calling another class in class, another method in class B, but if you do not define anything, then whatever sharing context of A will be applied to B. But if you explicitly define without sharing, then B will run in the without sharing, no matter if A is in the with sharing or without sharing. Okay. So if you will not define, it will by default takes A sharing context. So that is why with sharing is very important. Okay. Okay, this is irrelevant question from this. Uh, this might be LWC question. What is the difference between aura enabled and remote action? See, aura enabled we use to make sure that a particular method is visible in the Lightning Web component, and remote action we use this whenever we want a particular method to be executed from the JavaScript. We use that in the VF pages. We make a particular method remote action. We use this annotation to make a particular method available to be executed from a Visual Force pages JavaScript. Okay, so this is an older way of doing it to make sure a method is visible in your VF pages. Aura enabled is the latest way to do that. Remote action is a kind of legacy, to be very frank. We do not use it anymore. What is test data? Is test data see all true? This also is a irrelevant question because this is a test class question. See, as at the rate is test is basically when we are writing a test class, we will have to define this annotation. And see all data equals to true is that your test class will be able to access data from your Salesforce org. Okay, so if we write see all data equals to true, then it will be able to access data from your org, but it is a bad practice. We should not use this because then your test classes will be dependent on the data from your org. So your org might have data currently in the org where you are doing the testing, but when you deploy that data to another org, that org might not have data. So in that case, your test class will fail and you will not be able to deploy it. Okay. So see all data equals to true is more as a bad practice than a functionality. Okay. So try to avoid it as much as you can. We will cover this in detail when we do the test classes. Don't worry. In constructor, why we cannot use static keyword? Okay, this is a very good question, a fundamental question which can trick even the good students. Okay, in constructor, why not use a static keyword? We cannot define a static keyword in constructor. Compile time error will occur. Okay, static means class level. A constructor will be used to assign initial value to the instance variable. So constructor is defined to provide the initial value to the instance variable. Okay, and that is why we cannot use static with the constructor, because if we use static with the constructor, it will become class level and we do not have anything as a class level. Okay, so that is why we cannot use static in the keyword. If we do that, a compile time error will come. We can check this if we try to create a constructor with a static keyword. This should not allow us to save. Yeah. Static is not allowed on constructor. So this is the error you will get. Okay. So these were a couple of fundamental questions and these observations. You have to go through these observations first, then go through these questions. And I highly recommend everybody to go through these questions again and again and try to see if you are able to understand the question, and then try to see if you are able to understand the answer. If you are not able to understand, it is completely okay if you come back to me and ask that, sir, I'm not able to understand this question. Can you repeat that? I will repeat it 100 times, but I don't want any of my student to be weak in the fundamentals of Apex. Okay, because this is make or break kind of topic. If you are not able to answer this these basic questions very well, then you will have to work really hard on the LWC and trigger point, and then also you may get rejection mail because they may feel that this guy is weak in the fundamentals of Apex. So what's the point of he able to write trigger, right? If he is weak in the fundamentals, he might not be able to understand our trigger framework. He might not be able to understand the design pattern we are using. Okay. So fundamentals of Apex is very important, and I focus on this a lot. I ask a lot of questions from object-oriented programming concepts and fundamentals of Apex. Those who have given mocks know this already, and I want everybody to be strong in this topic. Okay, I will